Well, I was looking at this verse here in Romans 12:3 again and again and again. I've been looking at it for days. And people will read this verse and they interpret this as that God gives faith to each according to a part or a measure to each. But first of all, the word gives is not in this verse. Where parted simply means to divide and separate into parts in relationship to faith here. And if this was saying that God gives to each a measure of faith, and little faithing here, Matthew 8:26, was according to a measure, well, why was Jesus always expressing displeasure in those with little faith? We're here, the word despondent means low spirits, which is caused by loss of hope or courage, characterized by those with little faith. And the word despondent here is also seen in 2 Timothy 1:7. For God has not given us a spirit of despondency, but of ability and of love and of reason. So if God has not given us a spirit of despondency, why would he give a measure of little faith to those who are despondent? We're then here in John chapter 3, verse 34, Jesus says, for the one whom God has dispatched speaks the talk of God, for he gives the Spirit not out of measure. He gives the Spirit not out of measure, for God has not given us a spirit of despondency. Where again, despondency is characterized by those you little faithing ones, which would not be a gift that is given to them according to a measure of little faith. So we have to read this verse carefully. It doesn't say God has given to each a measure of faith. It says that God has parted measure, faithing, we could say of each, the faithing of each. To is added, the is added. What this verse is explaining is that not everybody has the same faith. Some have little faith, some have large faith, a large shield of faith. Of course, for those who have taken up the large shield of faithing, not been given it as a gift, God isn't putting the armor on us, we have to put it on. Where we also see an example of faithing in the least. You have become faithing in the least. God has not parted a measure of least faithing to these. And here we see little faithing ones according to the figure of an oven, to be cast into the oven, which is the judgment in front of the podium by fire. Here again, we see little faithing ones in relationship to hesitation, tarrying. God wouldn't give a measure of faith to somebody of little faith that they would hesitate. And here again is another example or characteristic of little faith. Over consideration through, which is commonly rendered as reason, but the concept here is a negative concept. In fact, all of the occurrences of this word is in the negative context, because it describes the process of thinking and deliberating with one's own reasoning rather than the wisdom and the knowledge of God in truth. Human reasoning. And then yet again, why couldn't they cast out the demon? Because of your little faith. So if this was a parted measure of faith, God's not doing a very good job, is he? So again, this verse in Romans 12:3 is not saying that God gives to each a measure of faith as a grace gift, but that he parts a measure according to the faith of each, basically is what it says. Which not all have the same faith. Where again, the word parted means to divide and separate into parts according to the faith of each member of the body of Christ, according to different grace gifts. Because when you move down here, here's the context of grace gifts, which God parts according to each of his own faith. If we just move forward a couple chapters to Romans 14, we read the one faiths, this is a verb, to be allowed to eat all, but the one being weak in the faith eats vegetables. The weak in the faith. So we have one who is weak in the faith and one who is not. So according to the parted measure of faith of each, we could say of each, not to each, of each, we can measure each other's faith. We can recognize if someone's weaker in the faith than others. We are here in 2 Corinthians 10:13, where we see another occurrence of the word measure here. Paul writes, "But we not will we boast toward the unmeasured things, but according to the measure of the sphere which the God of measure." God is the God of measure. He sees all of our faith. He knows what kind of faith we have, whether large, little, or least. He gave as a part to us in order to reach on unto you also. So each has their part according to their faith. Ephesians 4:7 again, "But to each one of us was given grace," this is the gift, the grace gifts, "according to the measure of the gift of Christ." The measure of the gift of Christ. So again, when we come back to Romans 12:3, Paul says, "For through the grace that being given to me," which is the gift, where people get down here and read this and they confuse faith with the grace gift. But this is not what it says. It's according to a parting or a measure, a parted measure of faithing of each. I think the two here is confusing. And the concept here concerning grace gifts, which Paul picks up here in verse 6, carries to the same context of 1 Corinthians 12:9, where people also misinterpret this verse to say that faith is a gift, a grace gift. Because here Paul is outlining allocations of grace gifts, which I don't think I have time in this video to get into all this, so I'll probably save this for another video. Thanks for watching. God bless.